The rain in Blackwood, Ohio, did not wash things clean. It only made the grime on the siding of the houses slicker and the mud in the unpaved driveways deeper. Elias Thorne sat in his armchair, a piece of furniture that had seen better decades, staring at the static interference on a television screen he hadn't bothered to turn on properly. At 55, Elias was a man carved out of granite and regret, his knuckles permanently swollen from a life he had buried 10 years ago behind the steel bars of a state penitentiary. The silence of his small, rented bungalow was usually his only companion, a heavy blanket that smothered the memories of the men he had hurt and the mistakes he couldn't undo. He lived a ghost's life, working shifts at the scrapyard, paying his bills in cash, and speaking to no one unless absolutely necessary, his existence defined by a rigid discipline of non-interference. The knock on the door was hesitant, barely audible over the drumming of the autumn rain against the tin roof, but to a man like Elias, whose instincts were honed by years of sleeping with one eye open, it sounded like a gunshot. He didn't move immediately, his eyes shifting from the grey screen to the peeling paint of the doorframe, waiting to see if the visitor would give up and retreat into the storm. No one came to Elias's house. The neighbors knew enough about his history to cross the street when they saw him coming, a mixture of fear and local superstition that suited him perfectly. But the knock came again, slightly louder this time, infused with a frantic, rhythmic desperation that suggested the person on the other side was not selling magazines or preaching the gospel. Elias extinguished his cigarette in an overflowing ashtray, the embers dying with a faint hiss, and pushed himself up from the chair, his joints popping in the damp cold of the unheated room. He walked to the door with a heavy, deliberate gait, his boots thudding against the warped floorboards, and when he pulled it open, the wind threw a spray of freezing water into his face. Standing on the porch, drenched to the bone and shivering violently, was a boy who couldn't have been more than 16 years old. He wore a windbreaker that was too thin for the season, his hair plastered to his forehead, and his eyes were wide, glassy orbs of terror that locked onto Elias with a pleading intensity that made the older man's stomach tighten. "Mr. Thorne," the boy stammered, his teeth chattering so hard the words were barely intelligible, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists at his sides, as if he were trying to hold himself together physically. Elias recognized him vaguely. He was the kid who bagged groceries at the local market, the one who always looked down when Elias placed his whiskey and frozen dinners on the counter. Elias didn't answer, merely occupying the doorway with his imposing bulk, blocking the warmth of the dim interior from escaping, waiting for the boy to state his business or run away. The boy swallowed hard, a painful gulp of air, and took a half-step forward, ignoring the rain soaking his sneakers. "They said, people say you used to be, that you handled things," the boy whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of his fear and the freezing temperature. Elias felt the old irritation flare up, the desire to slam the door on the world and its endless, messy problems. But he saw the bruise blossoming on the boy's cheekbone, a fresh purple mark that spoke of a recent and violent impact. "I don't know who told you that, kid," Elias rumbled, his voice gravelly from disuse and smoke, "but they were lying. Go home." He started to close the door, the wood groaning on its hinges, but the boy threw his hand out, catching the edge of the frame with a desperation that bordered on madness. "They took my mother," the boy screamed, the whisper vanishing, replaced by a raw, guttural cry that cut through the sound of the rain and echoed into the empty street behind him. Elias froze, his hand still on the doorknob, the words hanging in the humid air between them like a physical barrier. He looked at the boy's hand gripping the doorframe, the fingernails dirty and broken, and then up into the kid's face, seeing not just fear now, but the absolute crushing hopelessness of a child who realizes the world is a monster. "Please," the boy sobbed, the fight draining out of him as he slumped against the jamb. "They came for the money Dad owed. Dad's gone. They took her instead. They said they'd trade her for the debt." Elias looked past the boy, scanning the dark street for any sign of a tail, his tactical mind waking up from its decade-long hibernation, analyzing sightlines and shadows automatically. He saw nothing but the rain and the swaying power lines, but he felt the shift in the atmosphere, the sudden weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a lead vest. He had sworn an oath to himself the day he walked out of prison that he would never raise a fist in anger again, that he would accept any insult and swallow any pride to avoid the violence that lived in his blood. But looking at this shivering, broken teenager, Elias knew that some oaths were made to be broken when the universe presented a situation that allowed for no other choice. "Come inside," Elias said, stepping back and opening the door fully, the invitation sounding more like a command than a courtesy. The boy stumbled over the threshold, dripping water onto the faded rug, looking around the sparse, dimly lit room as if he had entered a cave where a bear was hibernating. Elias closed the door, shutting out the wind, and the silence returned, but it was different now. It was charged, kinetic, filled with the potential energy of a dam about to burst. He pointed to the armchair he had just vacated. "Sit, dry off. Tell me exactly who they are." The boy sat on the edge of the chair, his knees bouncing nervously, and began to spill the story in a chaotic rush of words, describing a local loan shark named Vinnie Miller and his crew of low-rent enforcers. Elias knew the name. Miller was a parasite who fed on the desperation of the town's unemployed factory workers, running high-interest loans and meth out of the back of a mechanic shop on the east side. As the boy spoke, describing how they had dragged his mother, Sarah, out of the kitchen while she was cooking dinner, Elias felt a cold, familiar calm wash over him, a detachment that suppressed his empathy and sharpened his focus. He walked to the small kitchenette, filled a glass with tap water, and handed it to the boy, watching his trembling hands struggle to hold it steady. "You know what asking me to do this means?" Elias asked quietly, leaning against the counter, his arms crossed over his chest, his eyes dark and unreadable. "I'm not a cop, kid. I don't file reports. If I go there, things happen that you can't unsee. And there's no going back to the way things were before you knocked on my door." The boy looked up, his eyes red-rimmed, but hardening with a newfound resolve that surprised Elias. "I don't care," the boy said, his voice steadying for the first time. "The police said 24 hours to file a report. They said it's probably a domestic dispute. They won't help. You're the only one." Elias held the boy's gaze for a long moment, searching for any sign of hesitation, any doubt that might allow him to back out, but he found none. The system had failed this child, just as it had failed Elias years ago, leaving them both stranded in the grey zone where survival was the only law that mattered. Elias turned away, walking to a locked closet in the hallway, the floorboards creaking under his weight. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small brass key, and unlocked the door, revealing a space that held not coats, but a single heavy duffel bag and a pair of worn leather work gloves. He hadn't touched these items in 10 years, but they were exactly where he had left them, preserved like artifacts of a previous civilization. He took the gloves, pulling them on slowly, the leather stretching tight over his scarred knuckles, a ritual of preparation that signaled the end of Elias the Recluse and the return of something much darker. He walked back into the living room, the transformation subtle but terrifying. His posture was straighter, his movements more fluid, the lethargy of the depressed loner replaced by the coiled tension of a predator. He looked at the boy, who was watching him with a mixture of awe and terror. "What's your name?" Elias asked, grabbing his heavy canvas jacket from the hook by the door. "Leo," the boy replied. Elias nodded once, a sharp, definitive motion. "All right, Leo, get in the truck. We're going to get your mother." The interior of Elias's 1995 Ford pickup smelled of stale tobacco, old oil, and the damp mold that infested every vehicle in the county. Leo sat in the passenger seat, his hands jammed between his knees to stop the shaking, staring out at the blurred streetlights smearing across the rain-slicked windshield. Elias drove with a frightening precision, one hand resting lightly on the wheel, his eyes scanning the mirrors constantly, navigating the potholes of the industrial district without slowing down. The town of Blackwood looked different at night. The abandoned steel mills rose like skeletal cathedrals against the dark sky, and the streets were empty save for the occasional stray dog or flickering neon sign of a liquor store. "You said Vinnie Miller." Elias broke the silence, his voice barely rising above the hum of the engine and the drumming of the tires on wet asphalt. "Does he still operate out of the garage on 5th? Leo nodded quickly. "Yeah, that's where they took her. I saw the van turn that way. My dad owed him $4,000. He died of an overdose 3 months ago, and the debt it fell on her." Elias tightened his grip on the wheel, his leather gloves creaking. The injustice of inherited debt was a common story here, a trap that kept families in a cycle of poverty and violence that was impossible to escape legally. "Listen to me closely," Elias said, slowing the truck as they approached the grittier side of town, where the streetlights were broken and the houses were boarded up. "When we get there, you stay in the truck. You lock the doors. You get down on the floorboards. You do not look up, and you do not come out unless I tell you to. Do you understand?" Leo looked at him, fear warring with a desire to help. "But what if—" Elias cut him off with a sharp look. "There is no what if. If things go wrong, you drive away. You know how to drive a stick?" Leo nodded hesitantly. "Good. If I don't come back in 10 minutes, you drive to the state police station 2 towns over. Not the local cops, the staties." They pulled into an alleyway 2 blocks from the garage, the truck rolling to a silent stop in the shadows of a derelict warehouse. Elias killed the engine and the lights, plunging them into darkness. He turned to Leo, his face illuminated briefly by the passing headlights of a car on the main road. "This isn't a movie, kid. These men are stupid, and they are cruel. Stupid men with guns are the most dangerous thing on earth because they don't think about consequences." Elias reached under his seat and pulled out a tire iron, a heavy, rusted length of steel. He didn't carry a gun. As a felon, getting caught with one would send him back to prison for life, but in close quarters, the iron was more than enough. Elias stepped out of the truck, the rain instantly soaking his jacket, and moved towards the garage with a ghost-like silence that belied his size. Leo watched him go, pressing his face against the cold glass, seeing the man he had asked for help transform into a shadow among shadows. Elias moved, not like a brawler, but like a soldier, sticking to the dark spots, avoiding the pools of light cast by the security lamps on the garage perimeter. He could feel the old adrenaline pumping through his veins, a toxic fuel that made his senses sharper and his heart rate drop, a physiological response conditioned by years of violence. He reached the side of the garage, pressing his ear against the corrugated metal wall. Inside, he could hear the muffled thump of heavy bass music and the distinct jarring sound of men laughing. A cruel, jagged laughter that made Elias's blood run cold. He crept towards a side window that was painted over with black paint, finding a small scratch in the coating to peer through. Inside, the garage was lit by hanging fluorescent strips. 3 men were playing cards on a workbench. In the corner, tied to a chair with zip ties, was a woman, Sarah. She was conscious, weeping silently, a piece of duct tape over her mouth. She looked terrified but alive. Elias did a quick threat assessment. 3 hostiles visible, 1 near the door, 2 at the table. Weapons were on the table, not in their hands. Glocks, likely stolen. He had the element of surprise, but he was outnumbered and outgunned. He needed a distraction, something to break their focus and separate them. He looked around the alley and spotted the external fuse box for the building, a rusted metal cabinet secured by a cheap padlock. It was a classic, almost cliché move. But in places like this, electricity was always jury-rigged and unstable, A power cut wouldn't be immediately suspicious. He smashed the padlock with a short, controlled strike of the tire iron, opened the box, and yanked the main breaker down. The garage instantly plunged into darkness, the music cutting out with a dying warp sound. Inside, the voices turned from laughter to confusion. "What the hell? Check the breaker, Tony!" a voice shouted. Elias moved away from the box, positioning himself just to the side of the metal service door, his back pressed against the wet brick, breathing slow and deep. He gripped the tire iron, feeling the weight and balance of it, knowing that the next few seconds would determine whether he lived or died. The service door creaked open, and a beam of a flashlight cut through the rain. "Damn piece of junk wiring," a man grumbled, stepping out into the alley, his weapon presumably tucked in his waistband. He never saw Elias. Elias stepped forward, swinging the iron in a tight, savage arc that connected with the man's knee. There was a sickening crunch of bone, a stifled scream, and as the man buckled, Elias silenced him with a calculated blow to the jaw, guiding his unconscious body quietly into the mud. One down, 2 to go. He dragged the man out of the doorway and stepped inside the garage, the darkness now his ally. The other 2 men were shouting now, their flashlights dancing frantically around the cluttered space. "Tony! Tony, quit playing around!" Elias moved through the maze of car parts and tool chests, his boots silent on the oil-stained concrete. He wasn't fighting for justice. He was fighting for efficiency. He needed to clear the room before they realized they were under attack. But as he crept closer, Sarah let out a muffled scream of warning behind her gag. The beam of a flashlight swung around, catching Elias in the eyes, blinding him. "He's in here!" a voice roared, and the first gunshot shattered the silence of the night. The bullet sparked off a metal lift inches from Elias's head, sending hot shrapnel into his cheek. He didn't flinch. He lunged. The distance was 10 feet. He covered it before the man could fire again, tackling him into the workbench. The table collapsed under their combined weight, sending tools and guns scattering across the floor. Elias was no longer the quiet neighbor. He was a whirlwind of elbows and knees, fighting with a brutal prison-yard intensity that prioritized survival over style. He felt a fist connect with his ribs, cracking something, but he ignored the pain, focusing only on neutralizing the threat. Outside in the truck, Leo heard the gunshot. He screamed, a sound trapped inside the cab, and scrambled for the door handle, forgetting Elias's instructions. He couldn't just sit there while his mother was inside. He fell out of the truck into the mud, scrambling to his feet, running towards the open service door of the garage, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He reached the doorway just as a second shot rang out, followed by a silence that was heavier and more terrifying than the noise. He stood frozen at the threshold, peering into the gloom, waiting to see who would stand up from the wreckage. The garage was silent, except for the heavy, ragged breathing of men who had exerted themselves to the limit. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder, sweat, and spilled oil. Leo stood at the door, his eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering in from the street lamps outside. He saw a shape rise from the floor, a large, hulking silhouette. It was Elias. He was holding his side, swaying slightly, but he was standing. On the floor, 2 men lay groaning, incapacitated by the sheer ferocity of the assault. The third man, the one Elias had ambushed outside, was still unconscious in the rain. Elias limped towards the corner where Sarah was tied, his tire iron discarded on the floor. He pulled a knife from his belt, a tool, not a weapon, and sliced through the zip ties binding her wrists. Sarah collapsed forward into his arms, sobbing hysterically, her body shaking so violently it seemed she might shatter. Elias held her for a second, awkward and stiff, before gently pushing her back to look at her. "Are you hurt? Can you walk?" he asked, his voice rougher than usual, strained by pain and adrenaline. She nodded, unable to speak, rubbing her wrists where the plastic had bitten into her skin. "Mom!" Leo's voice broke the moment. Sarah looked up, her eyes widening in disbelief as she saw her son standing in the doorway of this hellhole. "Leo!" she gasped, tearing herself away from Elias and stumbling towards the boy. They collided in a frantic embrace, clutching each other as if to confirm they were real. Elias watched them, a pang of ancient sorrow hitting him in the chest. This was the part he didn't know how to handle, the emotion, the connection. He turned away, scanning the room for the car keys of the thugs. He needed to get them out of there before reinforcements arrived. But the night wasn't done with them yet. From the back office of the garage, a door kicked open. Vinnie Miller, the boss, stepped out. He hadn't been playing cards. He'd been counting money in the back. He held a sawed-off shotgun, leveling it at the group. "You stupid old man!" Vinnie spat, his eyes wild with rage. "You think you can just walk in here and take what's mine?" Elias froze. He was in the open. Leo and Sarah were behind him, near the exit. He slowly raised his hands, putting himself directly in the line of fire, shielding the family with his body. "It's over, Vinnie," Elias said, his voice surprisingly calm. "Your boys are down. The cops will be here in 5 minutes because of the noise. You shoot me, you go down for murder 1. You let us walk, maybe you just get assault." It was a bluff. Elias knew no one in this neighborhood called the cops for gunshots. They turned up the TV volume instead. But he needed Vinnie to think, to hesitate. Vinnie sneered, the barrel of the shotgun wavering slightly. "I own this town. No one touches me." "Leo, take your mother to the truck," Elias said without turning around, his eyes locked on Vinnie's trigger finger. "Go, now." Leo hesitated, looking at Elias's broad back, seeing the blood dripping from his hand onto the concrete. "Go!" Elias roared, a sound so terrifying that Leo grabbed his mother's arm and dragged her out into the rain. Vinnie's eyes flickered to the movement, and in that split second of distraction, Elias moved. He didn't run away. He charged. Vinnie pulled the trigger. The shotgun roared, a deafening boom in the enclosed space. The spread of the shot was wide, but Elias had anticipated it, diving low and to the left. He felt the pellets tear through the shoulder of his jacket, biting into flesh, searing like hot iron. He hit the ground rolling and came up with a wrench he grabbed from the floor, hurling it with all his remaining strength. The heavy metal tool struck Vinnie square in the forehead. The shotgun clattered to the floor as Vinnie stumbled back, blood pouring from a gash above his eye, blinded and dazed. Elias was upon him instantly. He didn't use the weapon. He used his hands. He grabbed Vinnie by the collar and slammed him into the wall, the impact shaking dust from the rafters. He raised a fist, ready to deliver a blow that could end the man's life, his rage boiling over, 10 years of suppressed anger begging for release. He wanted to destroy this man, to wipe him from the earth for threatening a child. His fist hovered in the air, trembling. Vinnie slid down the wall, semi-conscious, defeated. Elias stared at his own fist, seeing the blood on his knuckles. Some his, some theirs. He heard the truck engine start outside. The sound tethered him back to reality. He wasn't a killer anymore. He couldn't be. He lowered his hand, breathing in ragged gasps, the pain in his shoulder now screaming for attention. He spit blood onto the floor next to Vinnie. "If you ever come near them again," Elias whispered close to Vinnie's ear, "I won't stop next time. I will visit you when you sleep." He turned and limped out of the garage, leaving the carnage behind him. The rain felt cold against his burning skin. He climbed into the driver's seat of the truck, where Leo and Sarah were huddled together. They looked at him with wide, terrified eyes. Elias put the truck in gear, his left arm barely functioning. "Don't look back," he told them. "We're leaving." He drove out of the alley, merging onto the dark road, leaving the violence in the rear-view mirror, but carrying the weight of it in the silence of the cab. The drive back to Elias's house was a blur of pain and paranoia. Every set of headlights in the rear-view mirror looked like retribution. Every shadow looked like a gunman. Sarah sat in the middle, her arm around Leo, weeping softly. She kept looking at Elias, at the blood soaking the shoulder of his jacket and dripping onto the gear stick. "You need a hospital," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I can't go to a hospital," Elias grunted, his face pale, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold. "Gunshot wound means police report. Police report means parole violation. I go back inside. No hospitals." They arrived at his bungalow, the sanctuary that now felt like a fortress under siege. Elias ushered them inside, locking and deadbolting the door, then pulling the heavy curtains shut. He collapsed into his armchair, the adrenaline crash hitting him like a physical blow. "Kitchen," he directed Leo. "Under the sink. First aid kit. Whiskey. Clean towels." Leo moved fast, fear making him efficient. He brought the supplies, his hand shaking as he laid them on the table. Sarah took over then. She was a waitress, but life in Blackwood made everyone an amateur medic. She cut away Elias's jacket and shirt, revealing the angry, pellet-torn flesh of his shoulder. It was a mess, but luckily, at that range, the spread had been wide. Most of the pellets were embedded in the muscle, missing the bone and arteries. "This is going to hurt," she said, pouring whiskey over the wound. Elias bit down on a strip of leather belt he kept for this purpose, a stifled groan escaping his throat as the alcohol seared the raw nerves. Leo watched from the corner, his face pale. He was seeing the cost of his request. He had asked for a hero, but he had gotten a man bleeding out in a dim room, smelling of violence and old regrets. The romanticism of the tough guy was gone, replaced by the ugly reality of torn flesh and the smell of copper. He looked at Elias's face, lined with pain, eyes squeezed shut, and felt a crushing guilt. "I'm sorry," Leo whispered. I didn't know it would be like this." Elias spat the belt out and took a long pull from the whiskey bottle. He looked at the boy, his eyes clearing slightly. "Don't be sorry," he rasped. "You did what you had to do to save your mother. That's what men do. But this," he gestured to his shoulder, "this is the price. There's always a price, Leo. Violence is a debt you pay with your body and your soul. Don't ever forget that." It was a lesson no school could teach, delivered in a blood-stained living room by a man who was a living cautionary tale. Later that night, the house was silent. Sarah had fallen asleep on the couch, exhausted by trauma. Leo sat on the floor, keeping watch out the window. Elias sat in his chair, unable to sleep due to the throbbing pain. The phone lines were down, or maybe Elias had unplugged them, he couldn't remember. He knew Vinnie Miller wouldn't go to the cops. Vinnie would lick his wounds, regroup, and plan revenge. But Vinnie was also a businessman. He knew Elias was a loose cannon now. He might decide the debt wasn't worth the trouble of waking a sleeping dragon, or he might burn the house down. Elias looked around his small, sad life. The few books, the old TV, the silence he had cultivated so carefully. It was all compromised now. He had exposed himself. He had shown the town he was still dangerous. He knew, with a sinking heart, that he couldn't stay here. The boy and his mother were safe for tonight, but as long as Elias was near them, they were targets. The connection between them put them in danger. "Leo?" Elias whispered into the dark. The boy turned. "Yeah? Tomorrow morning, you take your mom to your aunt's in West Virginia. You said she lives there, right?" "Yeah, but no buts. You pack what you can fit in the car. You leave at first light. You don't come back to Blackwood for a long time." "What about you?" Leo asked. Elias lit a cigarette, the flame illuminating his tired, battered face. "I'll be fine. I'm good at disappearing, but you two, you have a chance to start over. Take it." The morning sun broke through the grey clouds, casting a weak, pale light over the wet streets of Blackwood. The storm had passed, leaving behind puddles that reflected the decay of the town. In front of Elias's house, Sarah's old sedan was idling. It was packed with clothes and boxes. Sarah stood on the porch, hugging Elias. It was a strange sight, the bruised, battered ex-con and the weary mother. She kissed him on the cheek, a gesture of gratitude that felt foreign to him. "Thank you," she said softly. "You gave us our lives back." "Just drive safe," Elias grunted, uncomfortable with the tenderness. He handed her a roll of cash, his emergency fund, everything he had saved from working at the scrapyard. "Take this. It's not much, but it'll get you set up." She tried to refuse, but he closed her hand around it. "Please, for the boy." She nodded, tears welling in her eyes again, and walked to the car. Leo stood before Elias. The boy looked older than he had yesterday. The innocence was gone from his eyes, replaced by a somber understanding of the world's sharp edges. He extended his hand. Elias looked at it, then took it. The handshake was firm. "You saved her," Leo said. "You're a good man, Mr. Thorne." Elias shook his head slowly. "I'm not a good man, Leo. I'm a man who did a necessary thing. There's a difference. Be better than me. Be a man who doesn't need to use his fists to solve problems. That's the real strength." Leo nodded, understanding the weight of the advice. He got into the car, and they drove away, the taillights fading down the long, straight road leading out of town. Elias watched them go until they were just a speck in the distance. He stood alone on his porch, his shoulder throbbing with a dull, constant ache that would likely stay with him for the rest of his life, a reminder of the night he broke his rules. Elias went back inside. The house felt empty, but not in the peaceful way it used to. It felt abandoned. He knew Vinnie Miller's men would eventually come looking, or the police might start asking questions about the gunshot victims at the ER. He grabbed his duffel bag. He packed 2 changes of clothes, the rest of the whiskey, and a map of the United States. He left the furniture, the TV, the life he had built for 10 years. It didn't matter. It was just stuff. He walked out the back door, locking it behind him, and threw the key into the tall grass of the overgrown yard. He pulled his collar up against the morning chill and started walking towards the train tracks that ran along the edge of town. He would hop a freight train west, maybe head towards the Dakotas or Montana, somewhere with big skies and fewer people. As he walked, Elias Thorne didn't feel happy. There was no triumphant music playing. He was in pain. He was homeless again, and he was on the run. But as he touched the bandage on his shoulder, he felt a strange sense of peace. For 10 years, he had been hiding from himself, afraid of the violence inside him. Last night, he had used it to save a family. He wasn't a monster. He was a protector who had walked through fire. And for the first time in a long time, as his boots crunched on the gravel of the railroad tracks, he didn't feel like a ghost. He felt alive. The town of Blackwood faded behind him, keeping its secrets, while Elias walked on, a solitary figure disappearing into the vast, complex landscape of America, carrying his justice with him.